My name is Luanne. I do work for Massachusetts right now in the System for Adult Basic Ed Support. And we do professional development for practitioners. And we actually are performance-based funding. But for the purposes of this institute, I thought I would, after consulting with Linda, talk about the program that I ran that was direct service to students, because I think it more applies to the work that you're considering at this institute. You know, this program is about, it was a performance-based program. It was designed to get people off of public assistance and into full-time employment. Primarily our audience were single moms on what was at the time called welfare. Most of them had no work experience or really limited work experience, no employability skills, didn't know the first thing about getting up and going to work every day. So our goal was to get them jobs, and to get them jobs that they kept. Not just to get them jobs, but to get them jobs that they kept. That was an important key. You know, I worked there for almost 10 years. It was a moment in time where the right people were in the right place with the right vision and the right passion. It was just a synergy that is rare and happened kind of spontaneously. And all of the things that I'm going to talk about are not going to apply to your work. You have different contexts, you have a different population, but my hope is that at least there will be some principles or some challenges or some questions that you think about that you can adapt to the work that you're doing, which frankly, from what I've heard in the 12 hours since I've been here, is pretty impressive to start out with. So I wanted to talk about what were the important components of our success. In one of my conversations, somebody said something about creaming. And when you pay for performance, certainly the temptation is to take the people who you know are going to be successful, some of whom don't really need your services anyway, they probably somehow manage without you. And I'm proud to say that we never did that. We really took pretty much anybody who was interested in working who was referred to us. They were referred to us from the Department of Transitional Assistance, so welfare, it used to be welfare. Now, who did they not refer to us? Over time, we had this agreement where somebody was an active substance abuser. So somebody was an alcoholic or they were actively using substances. They just didn't have the stability to be in our program. But what we did is we referred them to a rehab facility that was in the community. People that were really such low literacy levels, we referred those to the literacy program in the community. People who were homeless, we referred them to the homeless shelters. So the people who weren't ready to walk in our doors, we sent them someplace else. There was always a plan B for every single person who walked in our door. So we were always the right program for pretty much everybody who walked in the door, but maybe not now, maybe not today, maybe a year from now, maybe 6 months from now when we put these other things together. And we worked, there were three organizations that worked together. It was my program that was funded by the state through the Jobs Training Partnership Act. There was the Department of Transitional Assistance, and there was the Department of Employment and Training. And the three of us worked really closely together. I mean, they were two brilliant people who loved their work, cared about the learners, knew that they could make a difference, and were more worried about what the students needed than what the bureaucrats needed. And the three of us sort of had that shared vision, and it was a lovely thing. And it made all the difference in the world, that shared vision. We knew that our job was to transform people from being on public assistance, being sort of these, what they perceived to be as victims, we didn't really see them that way, but that's how they saw themselves, to really being financially independent, stable, empowered, and having a sense of a future of independence and you know, a fulfilling life. So I don't know how to stress enough that the people matter. You know, it's an intangible. I don't even know how I got lucky enough to have the right people in the right place at the right time, I don't know. I can't even take all the credit for this program because without those other two people and without that leadership and shared vision, I don't think it would have worked. If I constantly had to be battling sort of the powers that be. So having the right people, you know, it's just critical. It's really critical to have this shared vision. And we met fairly regularly, especially in the beginning. We met all the time. We met weekly when the program was first up and running. But it was really not about how to fill out this form or what my funding requirements were going to be or what I had to report. It was about, here's this body of students, what do they need? How are we going to help you get the resources you need to serve these students? It was always focused on the students. So one thing is, we really thought about what the learners needed, what the students needed. And I hear often sort of this risk, well, programs will lose their funding. Well, if programs aren't serving their students well, they deserve to lose their funding. Sorry. I mean, our students are desperate. I don't know what your students are like. My students are desperate. I sit in interviews with students and I hear them cry. I hear them plead. I hear them beg for services. They need help, and they need it now, and they need good help now. They don't need to be in a program where people are trying to figure it out, and they're trying to serve 3 masters, and they're trying to make everybody happy. They need people who are going to help them move forward quickly and efficiently. So that emphasis on what the students needed was really critical. And having the right people who think about that and care about that will make or break a program. I have a note here about bold voices. So we really always were willing to go to bat and advocate for students. And when policies changed, or somebody from the main office came down, or somebody, a legislator came in, we were really willing to be pretty vocal advocates for our learners. And go, many a time I would go to the state legislature and testify for some pending legislation that was not going to work for us, or that was going to work for us. So I think you need to be, well, I shouldn't tell you what you need to be, but I guess I felt like I needed to be bold, and willing to be bold, and willing to stand up for what I knew students needed. In performance-based funding, the thing that was really great for us was that it was really clear to everyone what we were being paid to do. We were being paid to get students jobs that they could keep. That's what we were paid for. We weren't paid for students to show up every day. We weren't paid for attendance. We weren't paid for them to pass tests. We weren't paid for them to demonstrate on an assessment that their English had improved. We were paid to get them jobs. And so everything we did was focused on how to get them jobs, and how to get them jobs that they could keep, and how to get them jobs that would provide them with a family-sustaining wage, how to get them jobs with benefits, and how to give them jobs with a future. So it's a very different shift than the ABE system in which I work now, where we're funded to get students to perform better on the TABE or the whatever assessment we have. We want them to show learner gain. Well, of course I wanted my students to show learner gain. They had to learn stuff to be able to go to work, but that wasn't the focus. And how that translated into practice was very significant. So for example, I was really looking with interest at your camera program. We didn't have a math book, we didn't have a writing book, we didn't have a grammar book, we had a proofreading book. And we taught people how to type. And we taught people how to type business letters and reports and memos and invoices. And so they were using their keyboarding and their proofreading book together. So as they were learning how to type a letter, they were learning letter format, they were learning proofreading and grammar and what was proper grammar. And we never gave anybody back a test with a score. Like, nobody ever got a 95%. What does 95% in business mean? If you're an employer, are you going to be happy with the student who sends out a letter with only 95%, with only 5% mistakes? It's got to be perfect. You can't have 5% errors in everything that you send out as a business. So what we would do is they would type a letter, and we would go in and we'd score it, and we'd proofread it using proofreader's marks, which they learned, and then they would go back and they would have to type it again. And they'd submit it, and we would go in and we'd give them proofreader's marks. And if it wasn't accurate, we'd give it back and they'd type it again. And they kept typing it again until they got it correct. Because if you're an employer, it's got to be perfect. It can't have one typo in it. So that was how we functioned. And students would get very, very frustrated in the beginning. But in the end, they learned that it was better to take your time, do it correctly, and by the time they were done 5-6 weeks into the program, they were proofreading their own letters. Like before they give it to us and they'd say, did you proofread it yet? And they'd take it back and they'd proofread it, they'd come up with another copy. So then they learn to self-correct, which is where you really need to get people out. If they're going to be successful in employment. So that was one key thing about how we implemented the curriculum. At the end of the day, I really can't tell you how much better their English was. I can't tell you what their NRS score, if they went from a 5 to a 7, or if their math improved by 2 NRS levels. I couldn't tell you. I could tell you that they knew how to calculate payroll. I could tell you that they had all done individual family budgets so that they knew what the minimum salary was that they could accept so that their family could support themselves. Those are the skills that I knew that they had, but how that translated to like a TAPE test, I have absolutely no. There was a piece in one of the research papers that talked about supply and demand. And I thought that that was really interesting because over time, part of my role was as the job developer. So I would go out in the community and I would meet with businesses and talk about what they needed. I would try and get businesses to agree to interview my students. I would try to get them to agree to hire my students, but nobody would ever, the best you can hope for is that they're gonna interview your students. You can never get anybody to guarantee that they're gonna hire anybody. You can just hope that they're gonna interview us. This program was run by 2 people, by the way. There was 2 of us, so it was a small staff, but we worked hard. And I was saying before, it was really a clean, streamlined, because we were performance-based and we didn't have a lot of reporting we had to do, we got to pay a lot of attention to the things that really mattered. That's another real key, is minimizing the reporting and the documentation, because every minute that you spend writing a report is a minute that you're not spending working with a student. So we would go out, I would go out and I'd talk to employers, and as part of that conversation I would say, well, what kind of employees do you need? What kind of workers do you need? Who are you looking for? Where are your big gaps? And we all know that whatever the unemployment rate is, there are always employers that are looking for people that they can't find. There's sort of the skills gap that occurs where you have a lot of people out of work and you have a lot of people looking for employees, but there's a complete and utter mismatch. So what we started to do was go to the major employers in the region and say, what do you need? What are you looking for? And we started to develop curriculum around that. So our 3 major tracks were legal secretary, which now is kind of obsolete, customer service and data entry, and medical coding, medical terminology and medical coding, which was relatively new at the time. Well, medical coding now pays a lot of money, so I'm happy for those students who did it. But those were the 3 sort of tracks. Everybody did this core curriculum, and then you got to choose one of 3 tracks depending on your skills and where you were at and what it looked like you would probably be most successful at. But that came from the employers. That wasn't me saying, ooh, I think I didn't know. So it was only in being out in the community and really talking to people. And it also said in that paper that you need a salesperson. And part of my background was sales. I had worked for a personnel agency, and my job was to go out and do sales. So I knew how to go into a company and sort of ask the right questions and market what we were doing and to solicit their input. So our first conversation with employers was not, we want you to hire our students. My first conversation with employers was, I'm doing this training program. We're really trying to prepare students with marketable skills. What do you need? Tell us what you need so we can really prepare our students to meet the needs of employers in our community. And we took all that feedback, we developed the curriculum, and then I could go back to employers and say, remember you told us you needed that? Well, here's my curriculum. Here's what we're training students to do. Will you do an informational interview for one of my students just so that they can have an opportunity to practice interviewing and you can gauge how their skills are aligned with what it is that you think you need. Well, those relationships got cultivated into employers who would say to me, I get calls at the end of the day, when's your next group of students graduating? I have 15 positions open, when are you gonna have people to send me? But those relationships got cultivated over, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And it was interesting what was being said this morning about how do we get businesses to buy in? So I would say the shift in my thinking was, I started with how do I get businesses to buy in? I went to how do I get businesses engaged? And I went to how do I get businesses to partner? And then I went into businesses are starting to drive what I do. They didn't know that they were the decision makers, but they were really driving part of what we did, because it doesn't help you to prepare a student for a job that doesn't exist at the end of the day. You've got to prepare them for the jobs that exist, that they're able to do, and where there is demand. It all matters. So that connectedness to employers was a pretty key, and I was funded as, among the many hats I wore, part of my funding was to be a job developer, and my job was to go out, 1 or 2 days every single week. I was out talking to employers and I was out trying to market our services. I was trying to bring information back. We customized the curriculum. And here's the beauty of being paid for performance. Nobody cared what my curriculum looked like. I didn't have to run it by anybody. I didn't have to get it approved. They didn't care. They could have cared less. I could have been teaching basket weaving as long as I got them good paying jobs at the end of the day. So it made it so much easier for me to come back and say, we have to add this component. This is a really important piece. We have to add this component. We put our heads together, we'd find it, we'd write the curriculum, we'd implement it, and it was good. So, and it was always in response to what employers needed. So that piece of it was a luxury that I would like to say I enjoy in my current position, but in fact I do not. So I miss that independence. We ran the program like on-the-job training. There was nothing in our program that looked or resembled school. People sat at computers and they did their work. They didn't sit at desks. They didn't apply to be in the job. They were in the program. They were interviewed to be in the program. We did an orientation. We kept attendance records, but not because we had to record attendance records, because we aligned our attendance policy with employer attendance policy. And so when people were late 3 times, they got a warning. They got a warning. And when they were, they got a verbal warning, they got a written warning, and then they were exited out of the program, which was high risk for us because that meant we weren't going to get paid for that student. So in between those 3 things, there was a lot of advising, there was a lot of support, there was a lot of working with DTA to get them better child care, there were homeless issues, there were health care issues. So we would always try to get to the root of why is somebody not here on time and why are they not coming. So I have to tell you, in 10 years, I think we asked like 2 people to leave the program. Because the warning was not only a warning to the student, but it was a warning to us. Something is not in place that the student needs to be successful. Not in our program, but in a job. If you're gonna get a job, you have to show up and you have to show up on time. So it was how do we get those supports in place, not for us, but for them. There's the whole issue of practice, and I used to say all the time, there's the in theory and in practice. In theory, you can know how to do something, but in practice, actually being able to do it is a completely different story. So things like, after the first 2 weeks, students had to come professionally dressed every day because they didn't have professional wardrobes when they never worked. How would they have a professional wardrobe? And it wasn't that they couldn't get it. We had wardrobes, people donated clothes so they could get clothes off of the racks. They didn't know what professional dress was. They didn't even know what it was. So they would come to the program thinking they were professionally dressed, and not so much. So we would have to say to people, with a fingertip rule, if the skirt's shorter than the end of your fingertips, it's too short, you have to go home. And we would have to counsel them. So it's really practicing. And if you're a single mom with 4 kids, and you have to get up and you have to get professionally dressed every day, it takes time. It takes effort. It's not like throwing on a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt and running out the door. So it's that practice. So by the time after 30 weeks, it was a no-brainer for them. They knew how to do it. They were comfortable wearing those clothes every day. They had a wardrobe. They had interview dress. But it's the practicing of having to be someplace on time, having to be someplace professionally dressed, having to be someplace every day, even when you don't feel great, or even when you had a bad day, or you stayed out too late the night before. All of those things were skills that they needed for their job, so that was skills that they needed for us. So the whole, like I say in the paper, people had to do job shadows. And they had to do job shadows that they arranged on their own. I was going to do it for them. I was going to get them a job, and I wasn't going to do their job shadows. And they had to do community service. Probably the biggest thing that people griped about the most was the community service. They had to do some kind of community service, volunteer work every single week. And they had to do it because they needed something to put on their resume. I thought philosophically, you have a free program. It was not cheap. We're paying for all of these services for you. Guess what? You get to give back. You get to donate back some of what you're receiving. And most importantly, when somebody went on an interview, when somebody asks, think about the interview questions that you get asked. You can't always be sitting there saying, well, I think I would do this, or I would do that, or here's how I would handle that. You want to be able to speak from real, authentic experiences. Well, I had a time in, when I was doing this volunteer job, here's what's happened, and here's how I handled it. Being able to speak based on actual experience is how you get a job. not the, well, I don't know, I'd never work, but I guess I would handle it this way is not very convincing to an employer. And ultimately, the biggest benefit was the level of confidence. Being out in the real world, doing something productive, having that level of experience, and the whole how much confidence someone builds when they practice something every single day is huge. Like being able to go in an interview and know that you're professionally dressed, know that you know how to answer questions, know that you've had experience in a work environment and you've been able to be successful and you can talk about that articulately to an employer. So key. I think we spend a lot of time, in my experience, we spend a lot of time teaching our students how to do things, explaining what they need to know and what they need to have in place. And then we don't really give them that space to practice it and to live it and to learn it and to know it and to be confident about it and to go out into the real world as somebody who doesn't think they know but who knows they know. And that transformation is really key because it starts to be not just about their job, it starts to be about their relationships, it starts to be about empowering people to feel like they have ownership and control over their lives and their futures in other ways. So that was a big issue for us as well. And we always felt like our goal was to set students up to succeed in their jobs. Not to be successful in our program, but to be successful in their jobs. The first, I have a note here about how we took pretty much everyone in our program, and as evidence of that, after about the second year, our first day was orientation for all new students. First day, everybody had to go through this, and I had the list of sort of rules. And I would say to people, I can't fault you for not complying with a set of guidelines or rules that you don't know. So I'm going to tell you. And once I've told you, then I can't fault you for not complying with the set of rules. And I would say, I don't make the rules. I'm not the one who ever decided what was business appropriate and what was not business appropriate, but I'm going to tell you what they are. And you can like them or you cannot like them. Your choice. But the more closely you align with this set of expectations, you're going to either make your job easier, or if you're not going to align with this set of expectations, you're going to make your job a lot harder. It's going to be harder to get a job. It's going to be harder to keep a job. I can't tell you not to wear a tight mini skirt to an interview. It's your life. You're in charge of it. I can tell you that the likelihood that you're going to get hired is pretty slim. So your choice. And the first three things on that list were, you must shower every day. You must brush your teeth every single day. And you must wear deodorant every single day. Because that's the population that I was serving. Because it became apparent after a year that that was not common knowledge for many of the students who were in our program. And I would just say to everybody and say, we need to make sure that everybody has a common level of understanding about what's expected when you walk in the door every single day. And then we went into things about, you have to be on time. 3 minutes late is late. If you can get here 3 minutes late, you can probably get here 3 minutes early. 3 minutes late, 1 minute late is late. So, but that's where we started with students was, you have to take a shower every day, because that was not common knowledge. So we were really taking people who were pretty, I would say, pretty uninformed about, where they were headed and what the expectations were. And when we did, after 30 days and after 90 days, we did reviews. They didn't get report cards, they didn't get test scores, they did reviews like they would get on a job. And those were sort of trigger points to talk about some critical issues, some problems the students were having, places that they weren't compliant. And I had a standard line that I would say, which is, it's not really easy for me to say this. And I know it's not easy for you to hear this, but I'm doing you a disservice if I pretend that this is okay. And that was the basis for many, many difficult conversations. And those were conversations about abusive relationships that were hindering a person's ability to be in the program. Those were conversations about somebody who resisted, coming to the program professionally dressed. Those were conversations about people who had, delusions about the kind of jobs that they were going to get because they didn't have those skills and they were not there yet. Eventually they could maybe get those jobs, but not right now. And so we had many difficult conversations with students. But again, we would just say, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this is okay, because it's not. And you need to learn that it's not okay. And again, you can take that information and do whatever you want to do with it. But I have nothing to gain. It's not easy for me to sit here and have this conversation with you, but I owe it to you because I care about your success. And over time, you build credibility that way. Because people would say, well, nobody's ever told me that before. I'm like, right, so look at where you are. How'd that get? Where'd that get you in life? Just because somebody didn't tell you doesn't mean that it's not true. I'm the one who's finally going to sit here and tell you face to face that this is what you need. So by the time, in terms of one of the challenges, by the time the students, for all the success and what a great program I thought we had, by the time they left our program, many of our students did not like me. I made people, a lot of the students didn't like me. And throughout the program, many students really didn't like me, and they made it very apparent that they didn't like me. I made people cry. I did. I made people cry. And then I tried to help them uncry and, figure out where we were moving forward. But that whole being really honest and being really frank is not an easy thing to do. Because people have, a lot of the women that we work with were from abusive relationships. They did not have a lot of supports. They were, you had a lot of empathy for them. But that wasn't going to get them very far. What was going to get them far was sort of the reality of what they needed to learn and what they needed to do and where they needed to go. And I also had a business background. So I think if you are thinking about a program, you want to make sure, if you're trying to prepare people for work, try to have somebody on staff who's worked in something outside of academia or education, who's actually worked in a business environment. Because it's a very different level of expectations. It's a very different context. And had I not had the business background, I wouldn't have been able to do as good a job of preparing students. So really connecting and having somebody who has that business background is important. In terms of challenges, the performance measures have to be written in a way where you don't obliterate the neediest, most vulnerable populations among us. And I wasn't in a position to serve some of those, but we made sure that everybody got served, that everybody found, we never, ever, ever turned anybody away empty-handed. We always found a place for them to go. So that was always our commitment, that nobody leaves empty-handed. It's easy to be held to two standards. When you're performance-based in your funding, and if you're, I don't know who in the room is doing the funding, who are the funders and who are the fundees, but it's very tempting to be held to those standards. So the example I use in my paper is attendance. Like, if you're paying me for performance, then you should care whether or not my student got a job. It should make no never mind to you whatsoever whether I worked 60 hours that week or whether I worked 12 hours that week. So for example, I'm here in Canada this week. I am not working. I promise you that my funder is not entirely happy about that. So I had to explain how my parent organization was paying for my time and that it wasn't being billed to the grant. And I thought, at the end of the quarter, I'm going to write you a report and say that I delivered all the things you asked me to deliver. What do you care if I work 1 day a week or 7 days a week? It shouldn't matter. It's a trap. I don't even know how to say enough that you need to avoid it. Figure out what you're going to pay people to do, figure out what you're paid to do, and forget about everything else, because too often I see performance-based funding where people are held to both standards. And what happens is you waste a lot of time. I will go back on October 31st and I will write my quarterly report. It's going to be 850 pages long. That's how I get paid right now. That's how I get paid right now. I'm performance-based. And every quarter I spend 2 weeks, at least, writing a quarterly report that's 850 pages long. It goes in 2 4-inch binders. That's 8 weeks a year that I'm not doing work. At least 8 weeks a year that I'm not doing work. And that doesn't count the work, the time of my staff, and the other people who have to contribute to the report. You really don't want to go there. This was easier. This other job, 3 pieces of paper. As I said in my paper, 1 sheet of paper we got paid when the student was enrolled after 2 weeks. 1 piece of paper that I signed saying, yes, they're here, they're enrolled, we're going to keep them. 1 piece of paper when they got a job that the student signed and the employer signed. 1 piece of paper when they kept their job for 90 days. 3 pieces of paper. That's all I ever had to submit. They didn't care about curriculum, they didn't care about attendance, they didn't want copies of things, they just cared if they got jobs. It was a beautiful thing. I get the bureaucracy, I get the funding. I write 850-page quarterly reports, that's what I do. At the end of the day, students can't afford to waste their time. And in Massachusetts right now, we have about 20,000 people enrolled in ABE programs. We have about 20,000 people on wait lists. For every person who's being served, there's another person waiting to get in the program. We can't afford to waste our time. We can't afford to waste their time. People are desperate. They need these service. I'm preaching to the choir, but for heaven's sakes, why am I, think of what I could be doing with 8 weeks a year. 8 weeks a year. That I could be working with students, or that I could be helping students, or I could be moving somebody forward. And I thought I'd leave with a couple of quotes that were things that I said all the time, and 2 quotes actually, because I've told you some of them, that sort of capture how I feel about this work. And one is, I have a sign over my desk actually, which I hope nobody will find offensive, but it said, God helps those who help themselves, and so does Luanne. And when people would come in and they'd say, well, I need you to do this. You know, I'm not your mom. I'll help you figure it out for yourself, but you utterly disable people if you let them think that they can't fend for themselves. If you don't send the message that they can do it themselves and give them the tools to do it, and if you're always doing things for people, you're doing them a disservice. It's of no support to them whatsoever. And the last quote comes from a person named Tom Meacham. He's our GED chief examiner. And he says this all the time at meetings, and it resonates with me, and so I will share it with you. And he says all the time when we talk about, like, what are we paying attention to? What are we funding? What are we paying attention to? How are we moving learners forward? And his question that he always starts meetings with, I think it's so relevant, is, are we truly breaking the cycle of poverty, or are we merely turning out a bunch of marginally more literate people? And the way we break the cycle of poverty is you get people into full-time jobs with benefits where they can sustain their families and where they have a future. Teaching people to read at a higher NRS level is not going to break the cycle of poverty.